Good morning, friends. With the situation over the world at the moment in a bit of a crisis, our speaker today has changed what she was going to speak of, and will now speak on another subject, which is entitled Experiences of Post-ceasefire Peace Building, Lessons from the Past. When you're ready, Chris.
Hi, if anybody had come to hear about Liberal Democrats, then come back another time. What we thought we'd do, this was a conversation last week, so it's all been put together as in a bit of a rush, was to think that it might be actually useful to spend this morning thinking positively about what happens when eventually there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, and thinking that has some lessons for how we handle the conflict and what we do during the conflict, but also maybe some lessons for peace. And I tried to get Fran to do it with me because she's got loads of overseas peace building experience, and she was a bit reluctant to do it at short notice, but she'll think about it, and she might, I think if you ask her, she might do one in the future. I thought about how to do this, and there are places I've been involved in post-ceasefire peace building stuff, or indeed during conflict peace building. Quaker experience through the overseas peace building group and some of their projects, and going abroad as part of their projects. But I thought I didn't want to talk about those because some of those are still ongoing. And so I want to use Bosnia Herzegovina as an example, because I'm fairly confident anything I could say about the immediate year or so after the ceasefire there won't impact on what's going on now, whereas in other places some of the tensions are still in similar form. So this is going to be based primarily on my experience in Sarajevo with lessons from elsewhere. I was in Bosnia Herzegovina. The Dayton Peace Accord, if you remember, Yugoslavia, when it fell apart post-Tito, had a civil war that lasted 4 or 5 years. And the Dayton Peace Accord was negotiated in November 1995. And so most of the peace building work was happening through 96 and onwards. And I was there in 96 and then again in 1997. In 96, I was deputy head of mission for an OSCE project. OSCE stands for Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or in 1996, what most of the Americans were calling it was the Organisation for Securing Clinton's re-election. OSCE, Organisation for Securing Clinton's election. And they had part of the OSCE is an organisation called ODIHR, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. And that is primarily about developing democratic institutions in post-conflict situations. And I was deputy head of mission doing that in Bosnia. But I'm also going to draw on some of the peace building groups' experience, and in particular, an Italian organisation that's called Blessed Are the Peacemakers. I'm not going to embarrass myself by giving you the Italian for that. But I particularly liked what they were doing. They were working primarily in the Serb suburbs around Sarajevo, including Vagoshka, which is a village I'll come back to. I thought I might start with some slides, just because actually it's come off of our, so how do I actually now share it? Here we go. You should now see.
Yes, trees.
Can you now see some slides?
It's fine. We've got your whole desktop. There is a way you could, if you
yes,
could.
Yes, I know, but you can cope with this.
It's fine. Yeah,
I've cleared everything else off that you don't want to see.
Yeah,
so
that's better.
Okay. So just to remind you, that's what Yugoslavia looked like. Yugoslavia is a product of the First World War primarily, and then the Second World War and the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Yugoslavia really existed as an entity in that period primarily between the end, in the form that it was at the time the war broke out, between the end of the Second World War, under Tito as a Soviet state, as a communist state, under Tito. It's a country that from the outset, it speaks not only different languages, although Serbian and Croatian are remarkably similar, and you can get by. Serbo-Croat, just about, it exists as a language, but there are differences of some vocabulary. But crucially, they use different alphabet. The Serbs are Orthodox and use a Cyrillic alphabet. The Croats are Catholic and use the Roman alphabet. And in the middle, you have an area that is predominantly Muslim, as a hangover from the Ottoman Empire. That's when the Muslim population developed. So it was a country that had a whole mixture of peoples and of cultures and of languages. Tito, people on all sides in post-ceasefire harked back to Tito. Tito held the country together, and that holding the country together as a country is really critical, because during the Second World War, to understanding what was going on in the ceasefire period, during the Second World War, Yugoslavia, in essence, there were various guerrilla organizations, and in particular, the OSCE and the Chetniks. And the Chetniks were essentially Serbian, coming from the east. The OSCE were essentially Croat and coming from the west. Tito's partisans, whilst they were originally, there was quite a significant Serbian element, by the end they were from all sides, and that was the communist partisans, and they effectively took control after the war. But there were atrocities between OSCE and Chetniks during that war that, because it's only the Second World War, were within living memory and were unsettled business. And so the breakup of Yugoslavia and the loss of Tito's control just opened a can of complications around unfinished business of all kinds. And one of the things that happens we come in from the outside and we look at wars and we think they're simplistic, big international issues. And actually, very often, they are, a lot of what happens locally is about what your granddad did to my granddad. And that's a complication that we just don't get, and we can quite often thump our way through it without understanding. So what do we, as people on this call, know about Sarajevo? We probably all know that the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot on the bridge in Sarajevo, and that was one of the final trigger events of the First World War. We all learnt that at school. We probably also remember Torval and Dean and Ravel's Bolero. That amazing 1984 Winter Olympics gold medal winning dance. And, kind of it's part of our cultural heritage. That happened in Sarajevo. And that was 1984. And within 7 years, the country was at war. So what else do we know? It's a city that has the most amazing Italian architecture and a Muslim style old city, all sort of higgledy-piggledy together. And there were blocks of flats where people, Catholics, Orthodox, Serbs, Muslims, all lived together perfectly happily. Slight differences in the telly channels they watched, and that enabled propaganda to start to work as Tito's Yugoslavia broke up. Sarajevo in particular is a tricky place. It's a city, but it's got mountains all around. And that makes it very easy for it to be besieged. If you can get control of the mountains around, you can shell at point blank range into city streets. So it also makes it a really difficult place to actually get to. The best of times, getting into Sarajevo airport is an interesting and tricky thing because the airplanes have to sort of do vertical drop and in, and then vertical out almost. It's a very, very, very tight airport. And going into Sarajevo in 1996, there was none of the normal air traffic management stuff. So as an anecdote, the first time I went in, we were flying in from Vienna in a plane that was just taking OSCE folk in. And the first day he got halfway there and he said, I think the weather conditions have changed. I don't think I'm going to be able to get in. Would you like me to I've never had this before on an airplane. The captain said, I'm not going to be able to land. Would you like to go back to Vienna or would you like to stop at Zagreb instead? And there was a democratic decision by the passengers on whether they wanted to go back to Vienna or put down in Zagreb. And actually most of the young people went, oh, let's go back to Vienna. Another night in Vienna sounds more fun than Zagreb. But, a tricky airport to get into. Okay, the siege of Sarajevo, which went through till February, or really till the ceasefire. It was only lifted after the Dayton ceasefire. 12,000 civilians were killed, and just within the city of Sarajevo. And it became if you look at the map of where the ceasefire line was, you can see that Sarajevo was absolutely right on the front line between the territories that the Serbs were in control of by the ceasefire and the territories that the Croats and the Bosniaks were in control of by the ceasefire. So it's absolutely on the front line. And through the siege of Sarajevo, the Serb front line was on the hills, literally just across the river from the old city. So you'd be in the old city and you'd be looking out onto their gun posts, and they could see everything that moved in the city. If you moved on a road, you could be seen and could be shot at. And that went on for 4 years. By the end of the siege, that's what was left of the ice skating venue that Torvill and Dean won the gold medal at. That's 7 years on. That's what was done to the sports arena. It's since been rebuilt, but that's what it looked like. And this is a graveyard built in the grounds of that building during the siege. Actually, I'm going to switch to that one. In terms of what happened during the war, this is the river. You can see the mountains around. You can see how high they are. And it's this building I want you to look at for a minute. This building, you can see it in the bottom picture, is a very, very, very distinctive building. It had a dome, and then it had this very Islamic stroke Italian, a bit like Bristol Byzantine structure. Really, really distinctive. No other building like it. That was the National Library and the National Archive. And for me, the thing that I will always have in my mind for Bosnia was not the graveyards, it was that building. That was the National Archive. It had priceless works in Latin, Arabic, Cyrillic, and a pre-Cyrillic alphabet. It was the cultural origin archive for the Bosnians. It was right on the waterfront. It was utterly unique. You could not shell that building by mistake. It was deliberately set on fire and destroyed. And the unique archives, globally significant archives, were lost. And some on this call may find it odd, but for me, that was the greatest evidence of that this was not an ordinary war. It was an attempted genocide. It was an attempt to eradicate a people and a culture. More so, and for me, that was more significant almost than Srebrenica. Okay, let's move on to something more positive. I was living just outside Sarajevo and commuting in every day. I was living in a village called Vrgošća, which is where a lot of the survivors from Srebrenica had been rehoused. And Vrgošća is a really good example of many of the issues that we see in peace building. The first thing to say about peace building is it's a combination. There's two things I want to say about, and the first one is about how life goes on. Because I put this together quickly, I couldn't find my best photographs, but here's one of my photographs of a block of flats that you can see has been really heavily shelled. And yet there's washing hanging on the line. And in buildings that I would have thought uninhabitable, people had gone back in and were living there in conditions that I found unbelievable. And actually, that pressure, that desire to be back in your place, however destroyed your place is something really very fundamental. There's a really interesting book, which I'll hold up, and you may not be able to see it. I'll hold it up. It's called On the Natural History of Destruction by W.G. Siebold. And in there are some descriptions of the aftermath of the bombing of Hamburg. And a lot of reflections about how people react to that sort of mass destruction of their community, and how critical it became for people to go back and have a campfire in the ruins of their home. Their home was not inhabitable, but somehow they felt they had to be drawn back to that place. And that he talks about it in terms both of our desire to go back to the place that we feel is ours, even if it's not there anymore, but also an overwhelming human desire to reassert normality. And one of the things that I think I learned is that desire to reassert normality needs to shape what agencies do. Agencies are a bit inclined to come in and go, we've got to do new building, we've got to put things up, we've got to do this, you've got to have this, that, and the other facility. And quite often what people want is to quietly begin to do the stuff that's normal to them, even if it's in ruins, even if it's in really poor conditions. To be able to do what gives you comfort is of crucial importance. The other thing that I would say in that regard is these red marks. They're now a formal art project, but at the time, in the immediate ceasefire, what Sarajevans had done is everywhere a shelling that had killed somebody in the streets, they had put red paint. So although they were beginning to come out to the market to do normal things, they needed not to normalize it whilst they needed to normalize it. And it's a really strange balance, this I need to normalize and I need not to normalize. This idea of small things making a difference is really important. And one of the reasons why I've mentioned the Italian Blessed Are the Peacemakers was because they were one of the groups doing this really small scale stuff. Chess was always a big deal in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So they'd rock up in a village with a chess set, just so that the old men could sit down and have an hour's chess and the world could feel normal. Just for that hour, they could do something that they cared about. And I think I wanted to share that because it becomes important to what we do with places like Ukraine and the refugees. I had a slightly tricky experience earlier this week in some conversations about, well, we should be doing this, we should be doing that, and the answer, and we shouldn't be doing things that seem trivial. You know, people need food and medication and so on. Actually, they also need chess sets. They need those things that give them a moment of normality in amidst all of what's going on. Another example of that idea of getting inside. Actually, I'm going to take that down for a minute and stop screen sharing for a minute so we can talk. Another example of that, the importance of small things. One of the cultural activities that all of the peoples of the former Yugoslavia shared, was Halloween. Halloween for the Croats and the Serbs and the Muslims, but in a different way, was about going to the family's grave, going to visit your family. You know how we all visit our family at Christmas? Their tradition was to go at Halloween with your family to visit family graves and clean them and light a candle. And throughout the war, it had been impossible to go and do that unless your family graves were in the place that you were at the moment the battle lines had been drawn up. So they'd had 4 or 5 years of not being able to do this really important cultural tradition. And understanding the importance of that, a crucial piece of the international effort in that first November after the ceasefire, the first time it was possible, was to create safe corridors so that people could go and clean family graves and go and light the candle at them. And that understanding that things that may not matter to the international agencies, like have you got a roof over your head? International agencies can get very caught up with have you got a roof under your head? Have you got this, that, and the other material thing? And actually what folk were saying is, I want to go and visit my family grave. I want to do that tradition. And that night, the hillsides around Sarajevo, whether the graveyard was a Serb graveyard or a Croatian, a Catholic graveyard, or even the Muslim cemetery, the hillside was awash with little tea lights, as people have been able to get back and do that for the first time. And so that's another message about this, understanding what's important to people and letting that happen. The third thing I wanted to kind of dwell on is how long-term peace building is. Quakers have this incredibly long-term approach to peace building. There are places that the Overseas Peace Building Group have been working in for 30 odd years. And the Quaker approach to peace building in places like that has very much been, we're just going to come and visit. We're just going to be there. I was in one area where Quaker peace building, where one of the groups we were visiting said, you keep coming to see us and you never tell us advise us what to do. You just come and visit. Yep. That's all we're going to do. That's all we're ever going to do. Why? Because it's not for us to decide. It's for you to decide what's important to you. And if you need us, you know where we are. And by doing that over a long period, when the moment came that the different groups in this conflict were ready to talk, they trusted the Quakers because they'd just been there. They'd been there for so long that they weren't pop it and tell you what to do and push off. They were just there. And that approach is a really important approach to the way Quakers do peace building. But interestingly, I was in Bosnia long before I was Quaker, but no, not long before Quaker, before I was Quaker. And right through the war, the European Union, and at the time the European Communion was the EC, it didn't have a foreign policy. So the EU had no foreign policy, no basis for doing anything in Bosnia. But right through the Yugoslav Civil War, the EU had EU monitors embedded within Yugoslavia. Not doing anything, I mean, feeding information back home, but also just being there and talking to people and getting known by all sides. So that there was this body of people who'd not been trying to stop the conflict, they'd not been trying to do anything, they'd just been there as a trusted channel of communication. And that's an incredibly Quakerly way of creating a basis for the peace builders to actually do something. And it meant that when you went into Sarajevo, you had people you could, or anywhere else in Bosnia Herzegovina, in former Yugoslavia, who you could turn to and ask for advice, who knew who was who, what was what could be trusted, what couldn't be trusted, and would, act as a channel of communication. And, that's a crucial thing. And I assume those people are there embedded quietly in Ukraine at the minute. I don't know. But then the next thing about peace building, so there's that small things making a difference, doing what people think is important to them. Actually, I'll say one more thing about that. The most emotional thing I encountered during my time in Sarajevo was the Italian football team agreed to play a friendly football match in the ruins of the Sarajevo football stadium. And it was obviously going to be the Italian B team or the Italian C team, it didn't matter. But a team of people under the name Bosnia and Herzegovina were going to play them. And I saw grown men in tears at the idea that out of the war, the country that the date, never mind the Dayton Accord saying there will be a country called Bosnia and Herzegovina. The thing that brought them to tears was seeing footballers go onto a field in their nation's colours. And that gave them a feeling that, it's back to that idea that objectivity is not what peace building is about. Okay, peace building, there's the Dayton Accord. That's the peace agreement. That's just the peace agreement. Behind that, for every chapter of that peace agreement, there are whole books and books and books and books of papers. I think one of the things you learn about peace building is that before you have trust, you have paperwork. Until people trust each other, you can't do things informally. You have paperwork and you have complexity. And here's the government model. It's a complete and utter nightmare of a model. It was developed to try and just give everybody a sense that there was enough checks and balances, that a ceasefire might work. Our reports concluded it was hopelessly over-governed. They put so much government in place that it wasn't going to work. And the problem was that before the ceasefire, before the war, they'd had quite a complicated government model, because Tito had understood that to keep all these different factions in balance, you needed a complicated government model. And what the peace builders have forgotten is that without Tito, there was no ultimate referee who just go, no, you're not doing that. Be sensible. They'd forgotten that the top was not as high, was not as controlling, and that therefore actually complicated models were going to be really tricky. But in terms of how do you build democracies? Well, who's going to run the election? Who's going to act as the court that rules on the inevitable disputes? Who's going to handle that? And you end up having to have, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, it was possible to use basically an OSCE UN structure. You could bring in outsiders to run the electoral court. But in post-Ukraine, who will be the referees? Who will be the referees? Because Russia can't be the referees. Russia won't accept anybody else being the referee. So I have a real stumbling block of, I don't know who the referees are going to be, who the arbiter will be in any sort of peace building structures. And peace building structures require you to work with people you hate, and they require you to get people that hate each other into the room talking to each other. And where's the mediator? Where's the person who's going to be able to maintain that, not just to the point of a ceasefire, but actually through into a peace building exercise? And there are three final things I think I want to say in that respect that reflect the complexity of Ukraine. The biggest problem we had in Bosnia was displaced persons. And I am going to put the slides back up again just for a tick to illustrate, to explain this issue, because it's going to become a very, very real issue in Ukraine. Right, here's a slide that shows where people lived before the war. By Obstina, Obstina is a local government area. And what this has done is this map classifies the dominant ethnicity of each area before the war. And red means Serbian to a greater or lesser extent, over 50% Serbian. And blue means over 50% Croatian, and green means over 50% Bosniak Muslim. And here's the equivalent sort of picture of post-ceasefire, the modern cantons. And in particular, if you look on the east of the map, by the time of the ceasefire, the whole eastern part of what became Bosnia Herzegovina at the ceasefire, the area nearest Serbia, which is to the immediate east, was overwhelmingly Serb dominated. And if you lived in that area and you were Bosniak, you'd either fled or a displaced person, or you were dead. Srebrenica, for example, is in that zone. And on the whole, you had resettled into the areas just the other side of the line. And so, for example, I lived in Vogošća, which is just outside Sarajevo, which had been the home to a predominantly Croat, but predominantly mixed Croat and Serb community who had worked at the VW factory. And as the siege of Sarajevo began to develop, the Serbs had got out towards Serb territories and the Croats had got out towards Croat territories by and large. And for example, one of the people we were working with was staying in a house where a Croat family had packed everything, including the children's toys and the children's photographs and everything, up into the attic for safety and fled. And those properties, because there were a lot of empty properties in Vogošća, a lot of the Srebrenica survivors were rehoused there. And the question then comes, in creating the ceasefire, whose is that town? Whose are those houses? Are we expecting the people who fled, who are displaced, to come back? Are we going to move on again, the Srebrenica survivors? How far back do we go? Do we say, well, you are where you are now? And you say, well, where should you vote? Should you be voting where you are now, or where you were before you were displaced by the war? And in particular, there were communities on the red bit, the Republika Srpska bit of Bosnia-Herzegovina, that were now Serb majority, but had been a Bosniak majority, and particularly the smaller local authorities. If you let people vote where they had been before the war, you could have ended up with councils that were run by a group of people who could no longer safely even live in that town. So there's a real issue when you get these mass movements of people about what you count as ground zero. Where do you count? What is their home, and how do you deal with that in building peace? And I know people on this call have been to Palestine and will have been into some of the refugee camps. And when you talk to people who were displaced, Palestinians who were displaced from farms in what became Israel in 1948, and they're elderly men. And you know, I was there in the 80s. One conversation back in the 80s stuck in my mind. 40 years on, he was in his 70s, and he was saying, "One day I will go back to my farm." And that was still home, and he was still living in a refugee camp 40 years on, because he couldn't concede the possibility that that was no longer his home. And the sorts of, you can imagine international governments with Ukraine creating a peace treaty that concedes bits of Ukraine to Russia. That's possible. That's a possible outcome. But what happens to the people that were there but aren't there? And how do you deal with that? And that is a really crucial thing for peace building, and for, remember that guy in the refugee camp in Palestine 40 years on, still wanting his farm back. And two more short things. One of the international agencies tend to place democracy at the center of reconstruction. But then they sometimes face the dilemma of, what if democracy is going to produce the wrong result? And I was a naive old little soul, and I'm a lawyer, so I think democracy comes first. But what if it was going to produce the wrong result? In Bosnia, as an example, the international agencies, and they are amazing peace builders, they had got the leaders of the three factions to argue with each other around a table rather than shooting at each other. And they had that relationship pinned down so that they could manage it and support it, and so that it was a relationship that stood a chance of creating a long-term peace. But what if the election rules were going to lead to people winning in the election who aren't part of that relationship? If it was going to introduce new people into that table, and that was going to destabilize, what do we do about that? How do you handle that? Now, I'm a clear rule of law person, is, you know, you have the election if the answer's inconvenient or tough. There was a strong, I got told off fairly strongly at a very senior level for that, by people who said, you just don't understand, we can only keep the peace if we are able to continue to work with people who we can trust, that we've developed that relationship with. And that involves some compromises around rule of law and democracy, because building peace is more important. And I think that's a tricky one for us as Quakers. Building peace or rule of law? And then final question for us is about communication. And it's easy to talk about communication and laugh at American imperialism. But there is a real problem of how you develop communications in post-conflict zones where you're not a native embedded in the cultures of the country. And I looked for it, and I'm really sorry I couldn't find it. They produced, I know I bought them back, and they're somewhere in the garage, but this week I haven't been able to find them. They produced some lovely election posters. They wanted, remember, this is post-Tito Yugoslavia, so the history of fair and free elections was not an active part of people's memory. So the international community thought, okay, and this is primarily Americans doing this, they went, what do we know about Bosnia? It's a rural country, it's a peasant country. They understand markets, they have fresh food markets. So they produced all these posters about elections that had "Iboritse" across the top, which means you choose. And underneath they have pictures of one of the posters had pictures of tomatoes on a market stall, another one had potatoes. And the idea was, you're peasants, you understand about how you pick food at a market, therefore elections is like picking food at the market, you pick the one you want. To which the answer of the average Bosniak was, A, have they been to a market stall? Most of the food is rubbish at the minute because it's the first year post-war, and so the crops are rubbish. So what you're doing is saying, you can choose, but they're all rubbish, which was not the message they were trying to achieve. But also, there was something deeply, deeply offensive about America going, you're a peasant country, you don't understand these things. Whereas actually, the cultures of Bosnia and Herzegovina had, in various forms, been around for probably 4 times as long as America. You know, the great battles and formation of what became Bosnia and Herzegovina are things like the Battle of Pech in 790, whenever it was. And so there's some real issues about how we step back and how we don't make assumptions about what is going to matter to the people of Ukraine, wherever they are, in terms of being Russian or Russian Orthodox or Ukrainian Orthodox or not religious or whatever. And I think that has an impact for what we do in terms of how we help and what we do, and how much we put listening first and talking second. And I'm going to shut up. And I don't know if any of that provokes anybody to think about or comment on how you're feeling about Ukraine.
Thank you, Chris. That was interesting, informative, and thoughtful.
Yeah.
There is one example I perhaps would like to bring is as in England, Britain at the moment, we elect people to government. These people say to us, we are going to do this, this, and this. Elect us. So we do. But it turns out that they're going to do sometimes totally the opposite of what they were saying they were going to do. How does this affect the model that you have, where you say that say in Yugoslavia and things at the moment, having elected some people who are particularly dodgy?
I'm not sure what. I'm not sure what to say to that, because I mean it's a problem with all electoral systems, and particularly in post-conflict situations, people can't necessarily deliver what they promise. The particular sensitivity in Bosnia, and I think those people in Quakerism who worked in peace building in Northern Ireland saw the extent to which the nationalist factions, whether they be Catholic or Protestant, or in this case, Serbian, Croatian or Bosnian, have a vested interest in maintaining those tribal identities. And certainly in Bosnia, from very early on, a lot of the electorate, when I went out doing interviews, I was trying to report on whether the conditions were right to hold elections. And a lot of the younger people in particular were wanting to support candidates from non-ethnic parties. And that destabilizes the work that's being done to get the ethnic groups to talk to each other, because actually you develop you can easily end up with a model in which, although they hate each other, the ethnic entities have a vested interest in preserving ethnicity as the defining identity of a community, because they all then have the power base of their own ethnicity. And groupings that are coming in and suggesting that there are alternative models to that power base are threatening to all of them. And the fear of that threat can actually be greater than the hatred of each other.
I can understand that. Any other comments or questions, friends? David.
Way too many. This is what seems to be happening in Ukraine is sort of, it goes back, there's a history. It was, as I say, Kiev was a great city. Well, Moscow was not yet, before Moscow was even a village, and all of that. But in some ways, this is a resource war, and it's the first of the, and yet another climate change resource war. Syria was a drought partly, and people were displaced because of that. So that's one point, which doesn't add anything to the question. The question that comes up for me, which is caught up in the peace process, is around healing collective trauma, because people get stuck back in traumas that go back generations and are unable to communicate and progress. And I think that the question is particularly relevant not just in Ukraine and not just in the former Soviet states. Sorry, well, sorry, I mean Yugoslav, but Bristol. You know, we have the collective trauma of centuries of slave trade and piracy before that, which affects our ability to act collectively, coherently and intelligently. So going behind that, I think of meditation groups as being able to bring peace in an area before or after a conflict. And briefly, I have a little story to tell on that with Yugoslavia, which was, there was a phone call in meditation centers across Europe saying, Maharishi wants a group of meditators in Yugoslavia, or there's going to be something awful. And this was in the time of Yugo tours. Yugoslavia was still together. I don't know if Tito had died or not. I'd have to look that up. But it was in early 1990. And the message was put out that we need a group of 3,000. And I went and took my computer and put it in the foyer of a meditation center in Lancashire and sat there building a database of people who were going to travel out there by different ways so that it was coordinated. And as a result, we got one extra coach to Yugoslavia, but it was only 1,500. And I felt the same sense of sadness and loss that I was feeling for weeks before the Russians rolled into the Ukraine, because it didn't look to me like a military exercise. It looked like something shaping up. And so I've got this kind of personal connection to peacekeeping beforehand and to tackling trauma afterwards. And there's an element of shutting stable doors before horses are bolted and stitches in time. Say, you know, if only we could know that trouble spots were, that the place was going to be a trouble spot, and send large groups of Quakers or meditators or whatever beforehand to create dialogue, peace, and so on. So yeah, I haven't got a conclusion from this, but I thought to drop those two pieces into the pot.
I think that illustrates something that I think is a real challenge for us, which is in the current climate when people are, you know, focused on, if I have to sort another box of nappies in our drop-off point, you know, sorry, no, it's been wonderful. I think there's a real challenge for us that in a time when people are very focused on the material needs of refugees and of people who are in Ukraine and not yet displaced, how do we can be criticized for saying actually meditation is helpful, and that was part of my point, that the things that can matter to people may not be material needs. And I think as Quakers we're quite good at listening and therefore getting that people's needs may not be entirely material, but that's quite a tricky thing. So for example, I was I've been criticised this week in a meeting in our town about the fact that with the churches we were going to hold another vigil in Yate. Well, what good does that do for the refugees? What they need is food. And actually it's been the Christians and the churches in Ukraine who've been saying, pray for us, we want people to pray for us. And I don't know how we deal with the fact that some people feel that that's a failure of Christianity, that people are spending time in vigils and in prayer meetings rather than addressing the physical needs of people, when it's the Ukrainians who said, please pray for us. But it's operating on a different kind of mindset to the material needs mindset.
Just to add slightly to that, I was alerted to Yugoslavia, and of course soon afterwards all hell broke loose in Kosovo and all the rest of it. I was alerted to that by being in earlier groups going to Syria before Syria collapsed and to Iran at the time that the Shah actually left and just before the Ayatollah came back. And in Syria, we had groups meditating in hotels, and we weren't telling anybody that we were there even, or what we were doing. But the comment that we got, there was a day when the violence had become less in Beirut. It wasn't, we were there for the war in Lebanon, not for us, just to be as close as we could to a trouble spot. And the people who were running our hotel came out to our group, and we hadn't said a great deal to them. And they said, we don't know what you're doing here, but we know that it is good, and we would like to learn. And we were thinking, yeah, you know, wouldn't it be great if people got that all across the region? You know, we had influenced 3 girls running a hotel where we happened to be staying with a meditation group, and they could feel what was happening, and they could somehow see that reflected in the outside. So there's some kind of science of creating coherence in collective consciousness that needs to be better understood and valued.
Penny.
When I was in Cyprus, I was accused of running a CND cell in the British Army, which I wasn't. First of all, you ought to know that my husband had been in Cyprus during the Troubles, came back to the UK, was very persistent that he was going to marry me and no one else, and we went back to Cyprus. Now, what was happening was lots of national service young men who were going out to a situation they really didn't want to be in, and many of them were quite clever, had knowledge about all sorts of things which were useful to the armed forces. And they were lonely. And one of the reasons I got accused was they used to come and sit out on our veranda at night, coming in from the nightlife, sitting down, having a drink, discussing the world, thinking about all sorts of things that they never could think of while they were in the background of the armed forces, having a sleep because we had 2 spare beds in a spare room, and going at 6 o'clock in the morning in my husband's car to work. This extended eventually into another wife. They were and husband, they were from South Africa. And one was a Boer and one was an English background. They'd been thrown out by their family because of the relationship and crossing the boundaries in South Africa with marriage. They had a bungalow by the sea, and we used to go there, and so did lots of the others. And it was like the army didn't know how quite to control what was going on, didn't like the conversations and the criticisms that was coming out. But at the same time, it was giving young men who were way away from home, not wanting to be, a different background. But I came away from Cyprus with the belief in the army that I was undermining the system as a pacifist. They realized that quite soon, and that I was somebody that would go and reach out among the communities. I used to work sometimes with prostitutes down in Limassol, and it was an army wife not fitting the model. But then I was fitting another model that they'd never even conceived existed.
That's where to look at the moment. I read an article quite recently about someone who was saying that the idea that when there is a crisis, we send stuff. We send boxes and boxes and truckloads and goodness knows what else of stuff. And it all goes to this disaster area. The only unfortunate thing about that is that usually, a lot of the times, there is no structure in the disaster area and nobody there to actually distribute this stuff all through the disaster area. So you end up with warehouses full of stuff which no one can use and no one knows what to do with. Mm. So although we feel the need sometimes to send stuff, it's sending people to, as you said just before, just to be there, to become trusted in that way, so you can actually sit beside them while they decide their ideals.
I understand that about stuff, but we've been acting as a drop-off point in Yates at Poole Court, and seeing people come in who don't have the money to hand over money, but have been affected by what they see and are connecting to people the other side of the continent. I remember Yates is a Brexit voting town, seeing people connecting intimately to the trauma of people halfway across the continent and coming in with what to them was clearly the thing that they'd worked out what being displaced meant, and seeing people coming in with toothbrushes and toothpaste because that was what to them they were going to miss, or a group of school kids who came in with some sanitary ware because the school kids had thought, how could we cope without sanitary towels? To me, the significance of that connection that they were making to the individuals and to what being displaced will be like is really, really important to them, to the way they see the world as people. But also it's possible that people who have been negative about Calais, etc., may actually from this get a bit more connection to why people become refugees. And you know, that's going to be priceless if it makes us more understanding of what it's like to be a refugee and what it's like to lose everything, and how people don't lightly get on a boat or a train or a whatever to get to Calais, that they will only have got there through huge trauma and loss.
Sorry. When I was working with the Quaker Children and Young People's groups, one of the exercises which we often did, usually with teenagers, was that exercise, I think most people know, was you are having to leave the place where you live. You have to make a list of what you would take with you, type of thing. And that is a very, for young people, that is quite a powerful exercise, because they really have to think, you know, of what they would leave behind, what they would need, what they could take. And yeah, it is quite powerful. Any more questions and comments, friends?
I don't know why I want to share this, but
Okay, mate.
I'm gaining very great strength from the daily zooming into the Moscow Quaker meeting, which, as you know, is international and sometimes reach about 500 people. And also, I thought I'd make a list of the wicked dictators that have been known since I was born in 1934. And I came up with 12, but in fact, there are at least 38. And I found this knowledge surprising. But I just want to share those two things. I'm not quite sure why, but there you are.
How does one find the address of the Quaker Moscow group and the time of the meetings?
Sorry, what did you say?
Yeah, I was wondering about the Zoom address for the Moscow Quaker group.
It should have been circulated via your clerk, because it came
Okay.
to
Yeah.
all of us as clerks
Okay.
to send
So
on.
it's
Yeah.
in recent notices.
You haven't got it.
I may well have. I haven't found it. I haven't, but I haven't
Well,
looked. So
shall we send it to you?
that would be great.
I'll see you there then. Except they've got the BST times wrong, but never mind. It's at the moment it's 5 p.m.
Okay, thank you. What's that in UK time? 2 or 3?
Sorry?
What's that in our time? 5 p.m. here.
Yeah.
5 p.m. London
Yeah.
time. There's about 12 time zones listed.
Okay.
Hey,
Just want to say I found that very moving.
David recommended, you held up a book, David.
Yeah. This is a German mystic who I've studied with called Thomas Hübel. And he was born in Vienna, and he made something of a specialty of tackling post-Holocaust trauma in Germany. He went on a retreat for a few years in his girlfriend's apartment and became somewhat awakened and discovered that he had the ability to tune in, and he switched from medical training into trying to understand people. And I was studying in I went on a course about eco-villages to Germany, and I got a scholarship, a good big scholarship, and somebody on the course said, oh, there's a course next week with this guy, Thomas Hübel. The exercise was go and pick somebody you don't know and sit with them, and one of you is A and one of you is B. A, tell B everything you know about them. You've picked someone you don't know, right? And then stop, and then and no feedback from the other person. And then B, tell the other person everything you know about them. And I sat down opposite this lady, and she just told me all about my life from nothing. And we were told, this is an exercise from Thomas Hübel. And she said, Thomas is holding a course next week, you should go. And I sort of went, yeah, but I'm going back to England. And she said, yeah, I understand that, but you should go on this course with Thomas. And I said, well, I can't, because, I've got work to do next week. And she said, yeah, you could think of something. And I ended up going to a hotel in Hanover and doing my work over the internet and going to this week with Thomas. And I saw this man who had this ability to tune into a group. And bring them to a level where people were open. And what would happen, he noticed this and started talking about it. After a few days working with a group, there would be a moment when the collective trauma would surface. And I called it the battlefield when I saw it, because I hadn't lived in Germany and I hadn't got this weight of collective trauma, but it was basically people freaking out, not in a warlike way, but just wailing and all kinds of stuff coming to the surface. And at that point, you've got an openness to connect with where the trauma really came from that you have been suppressing. But it has to be done incredibly carefully. Thomas told the story of how they had done trauma work, had set up to do psychological trauma work with concentration camp survivors in kibbutzes in Israel. And what happened was the suicide rate went up because people were dealing with stuff that they couldn't handle. So Thomas has become a world expert in healing collective trauma, and highly. I'm still a member of a group that he runs, and he has a thing called the Pocket Project, which is going into, it's the Desmond Tutu work. It's truth and reconciliation, but holding a space and allowing people to surface what it is. And his take, incidentally, on Germany accepting refugees from Syria, where Mother Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das, we can handle it, we'll take them in." And they took 1 million refugees. And his point was that this was sufficiently removed from World War II for the Germans to be able to take in a group of people who had been severe, traumatized by a war, and help them, and that this was part of German healing. And I hope that Ukraine will turn into much the same. The Poles accepting 1 million people, 2 million.
If people want to start to explore, like that, some of the sorts of things that David's talking about in terms of their own personal narratives and their connections, I'm going to put the W.G. Siebold up again, because Siebold was a German who became professor of European literature at UEA, born in 1944, was almost certainly would have got the Nobel Prize for Literature, and was killed in a car crash in 2001. I just read anything, absolutely anything by him. And either you will then want to read everything by him, or you will think he's completely bonkers and you don't get him. But he's exploring some of the sort of, in an individual narrative form, some of the stuff that David's talking about the way we are connected to the past and the way we react to the past and the way the past informs us. So it's not fiction and it's not narrative. It's just, it's exploring that trauma of one German really coming out of the war, and why Germans have not felt able to talk about some of the experiences and some of the traumas, and but actually, really, really good literature. And it's an easy walk towards what David is suggesting.
What's the name of the book that you held up?
The one I was holding up was On the Natural History of Destruction, which is a non-fiction book by W.G. Siebold, but he also writes Austerlitz, Rings of Saturn, Vertigo. They're all, anything by him, I think you will find connects into, there's a book called Austerlitz as well, that will connect into what you're talking about.
I have a lot of friends in Germany, and I visit Germany often. I really miss having not been there for 3 years, and I often drive there so that I can drive around. And I can't cross the bridge at Duisburg, the Rhine brook at Duisburg. I can't cross it without being in floods of tears. There's something very moving about going to a country that we used to bomb to see people who I love.
Jenny, weren't you and your husband in Germany for a while?
Yes, I was just thinking about that. The stories we got were women sitting down and talking to each other about what it was like in the bombing and how they were in the cellars and how their children had been there for days and were hungry and couldn't come out, and how when they did come out, there was no home to go to, nothing, everything lost. But we did have also somebody that worked in the camp. He still had his SS uniform and he held it, valued it. He wasn't leaving go of anything that happened in the past. So you have Germans dealing at different levels with what went on there. I mean, what can you say? I was a different wife. I used to go and shop in the German shops by myself. My husband got told I saw Jenny down in the middle of Dusseldorf at 10 o'clock at night, and he said, it's all right. She was coming home from the cinema. And it was like, you couldn't, the English people couldn't accept that I was acting like a normal woman would in her own country. And I think that's the message we've got to give them, is back to a normal life. I'm going on a trip. My daughter's going to go on holiday with me because I never get holidays. And I am going up the Rhine to Switzerland.
Oh, wonderful.
And I speak a bit of German. I have some French, can actually swear in other languages, which is not what Quakers do. But it's when you integrate with people, you pick up everything. You don't choose what you pick up. The bad habits come with the good ones. But that's us as human beings, isn't it? When you break us down, we're the good child and the bad child growing up side by side and trying to be good, but it doesn't always work.
Picking up on David's feelings, I think one of my more emotional moments in life was one of the driving forces of Yates Twinning Association with a German town was a guy called Bill, who'd been in the Royal Marines running landing craft in at D-Day. Not just going in once. The landing craft, you had to take them in, unload, go back out, come back in again. And that driving back into gunfire is the thing that's always got me about the people who were landing craft crew. Yet he was a driving force of the Twinning Association. And watching him sit and get drunk with a German from our twin town who was in the Luftwaffe, who was bombing them and strafing those shorelines, and knowing that they could get drunk together. And actually, they probably had more in common than my generation did with either of them, because they had both been there.
And on that positive note, friends, I think we need to bring the discussion to an end. With thanks for Chris for doing this talk more swiftly than she'd thought she needed to.
Yeah,
and thanks to everybody for joining us this morning. Have a good, as the Americans would say, have a good day.
What have we got next week?
Next,
Hattie is going to be talking to us. It's called Being Flexible Enough to Start Again.
Wow.
Well, look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.